Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second, forum series. We're here live at the Gold Coast at the Jamaica Commonwealth Manor here at the Vibes Hotel. I'm Robert Scott. I'll be your moderator. And today we have our very special guest, Mr. Christopher Samuda.
My pleasure.
My pleasure, sir. So, as we all know, the forum series, it's where we'd like to share our experiences in Jamaica as to what has worked and what has not worked. We have a lineup of 10 interesting series here for you. Today we'll be dealing with Monetizing Sports, the truth's path to Sports Association's independence. Tomorrow morning we will have the legal side of sports, a brief introduction to the do's and don'ts. Will also be held by Christopher Samuda, our Olympic Association president. And in the afternoon, we'll have driving athletic performance through medical science. And all topics, I'm sure, will be quite interesting. If you're just joining us, you'd have missed yesterday's wonderful presentation by our first Vice President Stokes, who spoke about the bobsled experience. If you come down to the Gold Coast, you can still get his book. We still have a few on sale for the remainder of the time here. But our business today is to talk about a very important person with Mr. Christopher Samuda, who is the president of the Jamaica Olympic Association. He's an attorney at law, but we won't hold that against him, as the founding partner of the law firm Samuda and Johnson, where he is a marketing partner and head of the firm's housing and real estate department, intellectual property, patent and trademark department. He has served on numerous government and private sector boards and currently is the president of the Jamaica Olympic Association and president of the Jamaica Paralympic Association. He has been active in artist management and he's a partner behind Jamaica's very successful The Business of Sports Conference held annually in Jamaica. Now, Chris, we're talking about monetizing sports, and I think this is something that is of interest to all of us. There are some sports, like my sport, rowing, which is just struggling, trying to get on its feet. We don't have the support of a wide base of support of fans. So what do we do to raise funds? We have other sports that may have been a benefactor of lots of money over the years, whether through sponsorship or otherwise, and sometimes that has just dried up, and they find themselves in a very difficult position. And again, we also have other sports that may have made a deal with the devil. They're not really satisfied with that relationship that they have, and they certainly would like to start afresh, but they're unsure how to do this. And of course, they've gotten within their comfort zone. So there's discomfort all around. So certainly, if we're looking at how we become independent, I think we really need to speak to someone like yourself, Chris, which has wonderful experience. So I invite you to speak at length, and we can certainly take questions from myself and other members of the panel who are in the room.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think this is a topic which is very critical. If you just look at monetization, for instance, there are so many technical definitions of monetization, but I think the relevant definition for our discourse this morning is earning income revenue from your asset or business. And if we apply that to sport, a sports association must earn from their asset or their business. And sport has evolved into a big business, and I think we all recognize this. And therefore, particular attention has to be paid to your asset. And what is your asset? Your asset really is your athletes. Your athletes, those are your assets. Of course, the evolution of sport has caused many associations to earn independently of their athletes. But let us focus more so on the athletes first. I think what we have to understand is certainly in a competitive environment in which we find ourselves as associations, trying to survive when the sponsorship dollar is dwindling every day, and when, of course, more sports disciplines are coming into the fold. We have to look at a contractual relationship with our athletes. Clearly, it has to be a win-win situation. If we're going to be earning from the asset, which is the athlete, then the rubric must be a legal framework. And when I say that, I mean that we have to enter formally into the contract with our athletes. So, for instance, in the Paralympic movement, each athlete that represents Jamaica on the international stage is contracted to the association. It not only defines the conduct of the athlete and defines, of course, the perspectives of the association insofar as they impact the athletes, but it also gives the athletes a chance to earn. And why I say that? Because we are actively involved in an environment where you have to, of course, generate business. And we come to the other aspect of the definition, earning revenue from asset and your business. You have sponsorship contracts. You have other contractual arrangements from which the athlete and the association can derive revenue. But that contract gives you the framework within which all rights are delineated and people understand their respective roles. So the athlete will understand that, yes, whereas the association may earn from endeavors of his or endeavors created by the association, he will be or she will be entitled to a certain percentage of that earnings, while the association will be entitled to a percentage also. So it defines the respective rights of the parties in the context of revenue generation. It defines the rights of the respective parties in terms of image rights. And certainly I commend that relationship because it brings us a level of certainty to the relationship between the athlete and the association. So that's the first thing. How do you define your relationship? And certainly it is by way of contract. Sometimes some people allow a flexibility of the arrangement. It is not codified, but people understand. But I suspect, being in a profession that prefers black and white, I always commend that you must codify your relationship. Furthermore, it gives the athletes some certainty in terms of tenure. It might be 3-5 years. For 3-5 years, the athlete knows that it is covered, he or she is covered under agreement. It also gives the association certainty in terms of revenue. But that apart, of course, the contractual arrangement is in place. You have to earn, and you have to find ways of earning. And it's very peculiar, very interesting that the topic says independence of the association. Independence from whom? Independence from what? We know that a lot of associations depend on the sponsorship dollar. Cannot continue. The sponsorship dollar is dwindling with the passage of every day. So we have to find independent sources of revenue. Independent from, of course, government funding, because government's resources are also limited. And therefore you have to find creative ways of earning your revenue and ensuring that there's not a lot of dependence on government revenue. Independent from the socialized influences that come with a financial sector that might be unstable. So we have to look at an association and say, ladies and gentlemen, we have to earn or keep. Earn our independence, rather than circumstantial evidence or factors propelling us to that independence. And I think it is important the association needs also to have an infrastructure which lends to that, of course. It's not business as usual, it's business as unusual. So the infrastructure in the association has to support that revenue generation. It has to support that contractual framework. It has to support, of course, the whole issue of the relationship with government. So importantly, persons in an association, and we come to another aspect of it, have to understand that it is a business first. As I always say in my sphere of practice, you have to have the business of law before you have the practice of law. If you don't have the business of law, then you can put 2 X's on the door and go home. It's a business, and therefore you have to have the resident expertise in your association to ensure that that is, of course, the case. So when we look at the infrastructure to support the monetization of your asset, which is your athlete, and the monetization in the context of generating new business, let us look at the infrastructure. Normally, or usually or traditionally, sport is viewed as an administration. It cannot be. I much prefer to use the terminology, Robert, of sport governance and sport management rather than sport administration. Yes, it might be semantics, but I think it conveys a certain meaning that I think our audience will appreciate having regard to how sport has evolved, not only domestically, but regionally and internationally. It's governance. It's management. And therefore you have to import the expertise that complement that structure and framework. So no longer are persons looking at associations and saying, okay, fine, we are volunteers, we can run it. Cannot be. You have to get the expertise in, and you have to create the infrastructure and the framework that will facilitate that revenue generation of which we speak. and which of course will, and I use this word advisedly, exploit the assets that you have as an association. So you're looking at perhaps a CEO or general manager. You're looking at a communication specialist, and as you know, we have decided to go that path in Jamaica, and I am sure that many persons have realized that it is paying dividends. You bring in your financial expert, because if you want to grow the revenue, you have to have somebody with requisite skills and competencies to know the math, debit, credit, plus, minus, fundamentally. You have to bring in your marketers. But you have to be very careful in terms of the infrastructure, because you don't want to be top-heavy when your revenue base is not there to support it. So it has to be incremental, and it has to be in accordance with your strategic and business plan. So the infrastructure has to be there in order to support the monetization and support the independence of the association. And critically, from a cultural point of view, the vision has to be bought. You can't have a half-hearted approach, or someone who is in fact in sync with the vision, trying to articulate it or to try to activate it. So the vision has to be absolutely clear in terms of how you build your infrastructure that, of course, will facilitate your business endeavors and the monetization of your assets. Of course, in terms of monetization, you also have in terms of your legal framework, your copyright, your image rights. That's perhaps another subject that we can perhaps think of on the next occasion. But clearly, I own my face, which of course is the position of the athlete, and also with the position of the coach and the manager. Those are things that you're going to have to address in terms of your contractual framework. I always say that you never give up your image rights. You only license them. So in the context of a contractual arrangement with the federation or the association, it's under license. You never give up your image rights. You license and they always revert to you, because that is very critical. Certainly, in terms of the athlete's development, yes, there's uncertainty. There will always be injury. But in the context of monetization of the asset, that is where now you have to bring in your technical people to ensure that the asset is preserved. You can't be monetizing an asset which is dead, moribund, has no value. So you have to bring in the technical experts to ensure that that asset is preserved and you have longevity in terms of the athlete. And it's critical also in terms of athlete long-term development. And this is something people always divorce that from the business aspect of an association. Not so at all. Because as I have indicated, if you are going to preserve the asset, then you must address, of course, the whole question of how you bring in your technical experts and they apply the knowledge and science to the physical development, the emotional development of the athlete. So infrastructure as well, that comes back to infrastructure. You not only have your management expertise in terms of your CEO, your corporate communication specialist, your marketers, but a critical part of the cadre of professionals, your coach, your technical people, even your psychologists. So people have to understand that there is a marriage of expertise in the quest of sensibly monetizing your asset and also gaining independence of the association. Each has a role to play, but clearly one has to define the role and one has to ensure that there is not a contamination of roles, because if you do that, then the asset is at risk. So people have to understand the respective roles, realize that, yes, there is a synergy, but at the same time, there's a separatist perception, and there has to be a clear demarcation of roles to preserve the asset and to ensure the independence of the association. If we look at how sport is evolving now, sport has a lot of human factors at interplay. So you have the respective professionals. You have also the sponsors as well, which is a critical part of how you monetize your asset. We are normally accustomed to just receiving a check and a photo op. That can't be. One has to be very strategic, and I'm talking in terms of the management and the governance of the association. How do you use that sponsorship dollar in order to accentuate and grow the asset and to preserve it? Because of the exigencies of life, we always deploy that funds to going on, we have to pay the bill to go on the trip. We have to pay the bill for gears. We have to get out of that psychology and look at how we can use the sponsorship dollar to preserve the asset. So it may be in the course of a camp. It may be in terms of professional intervention. I've always said the psychologist is exceptionally important in building self-esteem, which is so critical and which translates to performance. You may be speaking of your chiropractor, your biomechanics specialist. How can you, in your contractual relationship, and we come back now to contractual terms, with your sponsor, devote some of that sponsorship dollar to the development of the asset and to the independence of the association? Because if you develop the asset and you earn from the asset to the extent that you can, of course, support and maintain your cost structure, then that's part and parcel of gaining your independence as an association.
Chris, you said a lot, and I want to set a few things right now.
Absolutely.
It's quite interesting. So what I understand that there certainly has to be a business model.
Yes.
Your athlete is that core asset of your organization. So I want to talk a little bit about managing that risk. Was it Ralph Waldo Emerson that said, "Youth is wasted on the young"?
Absolutely.
So we do know that we may have a particular contract, but to behavior, dabbling in substances that they ought not to be, that they know pose a risk. How would one insure against that happening? How would one manage the risk to the association and to your future earnings?
I've always felt, Robert, education is the foundation, if not the architecture. You have to educate your athlete as to the risk to him or herself first, then to association, and equally of importance to country. So educating the athlete, but education of the athlete is not in isolation. We don't have a silo experience in sport. So you also have to educate the manager and the coach. They have to understand that that is non-negotiable, absolutely non-negotiable. When you are satisfied that you have the requisites in place, and the athlete, coach, manager, and even the administrator are quite au fait with the rules of the game and how you should play the game, then it is a question of now how you change the game in terms of your athlete. Yes, there is a risk, and sometimes unwittingly or unconsciously, the risk may become a stumbling block. But I think what we need to do, particularly in Jamaica, is to reinforce the importance of self first. Right? Too often, because of the business of sport, the athletes and the athlete's self-esteem and self-actualization get lost in the dollars and the cents and the performance criteria. We have to say to the athlete, you come first. And that really is the only thing that matters. Everything comes afterwards. So in terms of the risk, it can be managed. We will never be able to eliminate, because life in and of itself is how you minimize risks. It's not a question of eliminating. But when the risk is exposed, it is how you treat it as well. Education is the foundation, Robert.
Indeed. So I want to continue in the realm of
you're
looking at the asset or the athlete as an asset. And in my world, I'm in manufacturing.
Yes.
My asset is a piece of equipment with a useful life of 10 years, but you sometimes squeeze 30 years out of it. But an athlete's lifespan as a performer, as an earner, is finite. So therefore, it speaks to the whole issue of talent identification and talent development. Speak to us in the terms of monetization. How do we go about identifying that asset and putting it in a frame so that we can earn?
We all usually talk about the eye of sport in a different context. Normally it is commentary. Normally it is a position that is adopted, whether by other journalists or otherwise. But you have to put your eye on the athlete. And I use, for instance, Usain started off, as we know, as a 400-meter specialist. But Glenn has an eye for talent and an eye for the athlete. and he has an eye on the athlete. And he was able to transition, you see, to 1 and 2 very successfully. So first of all, yes, you have to have that expertise to know, to look on the physiology of an athlete, to look at the mental approach of the athlete, to look on how he distributes his energy in a particular event, and see how best you can match his talent with a particular event. And let us go outside of track and field as well. You have that in other disciplines as well. How do you measure the athlete appropriately to ensure that you have optimum results? You have to have an eye. Not everyone has an eye. It comes naturally for some, others it is trained. But you have to have an eye in terms of identifying that talent. Because if you don't match that talent intelligently with the event, there will be failure. There won't be the monetization of which we speak. And if the athlete is in the context of association, there won't be the independence in that respect for the association. So it's an eye that you have to have. And sometimes, let us look at the context in which you may go to a meet, a badminton tournament, you may go to a swimming meet, and you see the talent. But I think sport has gone beyond that now. We have to manage the process. And we have to be very, should I say, clinical. So as you know, what we are proposing at the Jamaica Olympic Association, the Jamaica Commonwealth Games Association, is to have a draft each year. The resources may not permit it, so you might have it 2 or 3 years, but certainly within the quadrennial between Olympic Games. And the system has to be very clinical. You have to have your experts there who will be in a position to identify the talent. You have to have your psychologists there. It's almost a science, Robert. It's no longer experiential. It's a science. And we have to apply that science to the methodology of selection and identify the talent. So you have a controlled environment where you go and you shop for talent. And should I say advisedly, you purchase talent.
So Chris, what I'm also getting from this conversation is the talent that you're seeking is not only the talent of the athlete, but the organizational talent. You mentioned the professionalization of the sport. You mentioned identifying people who can go up there and not only identify the talent, but put that structure in place to develop the talent as an individual, as an athlete, and as a future business person. And I think that is really, really amazing approach. Let us speak a little bit, and if we build a little bit from the foundation outward, we look at some sports, and as you know, in our country, football, the mass sports are the easiest ones to get some level of support because they have a lot more eyes. But when you look at some sports such as sailing, such as rowing, others which may one assume to be almost elite, so would have much more of a narrow base of support. What's the opportunity for them to build out that structure which you speak, which goes very naturally for athletics and say football?
That's the reality that smaller sports face. The sponsor likes a huge return, and that comes with numbers, numerical strength, football, track and field, cricket, and so on. I think in terms of a small association, it comes back to how you treat your asset. If you know, for instance, the reality of the marketplace and the reality of the sponsorship's wallet, then what you're going to have to do is to create the asset in such a way that it becomes appealing. And I'm not going to call names, but international tennis, we have had many who have not won a Grand Slam, but who have earned far more than others. So what you have to do is to create a poster boy and a poster girl. And it comes back to how you treat the asset. If you are at a disadvantage, it means that you have to go beyond the blackboard to create the poster boy and poster girl. So you bring in your professionals. It may not be the person who plays the best or wins the most tournament, but it may be the person who the sponsor, the marketer, the financier, the businessman and the businesswoman may prefer to have on a billboard with signal returns. Creating a poster boy, creating a poster girl. But that in and of itself is not going to entirely create a viable revenue platform for you. You have to look in terms of how you re-educate the sponsor and re-educate the financer. And I've been quite bold in saying that sometimes, and yes, I do not have perhaps the competency of some very experienced businessmen, but sometimes you have to bring the sponsor and the financer to the table and reorientate them and give them a better option as to how they can get a better ROI, particularly in sport. And we have competencies in sport that we can marry with their competencies and come up with something that will be a win-win situation. So you bring your asset to the table, having, of course, groomed your asset. So you don't want to bring the asset to the table and then people have a sense of disappointment and then get up from the table. And then you have to demonstrate that whereas, yes, they may get greater visibility from mass sport, the ROI on this asset is greater because you can transform that asset into an international asset far easier than a team. So that is a critical element that we have to bear in mind.
And I think the sponsor that I've said, like you said, both,
yes,
for the longest period of time, have actually benefited significantly
absolutely
from that. Now, if we were to look again in another aspect of that, so we spoke about the athlete. We now look at events, entertainment. Sports have moved from beyond just purely sports. It's about entertainment and entertainment value. So some organizations do have events that attract quite a bit of support. But you just said a while ago that we have to reorient and re-educate our sponsors. And unfortunately, most sponsors think about putting up a few feather banners and the photo up and what have you. What would be your advice to those sponsors in terms of maximizing the return on investment for participating in particular events?
I think the marketplace, you have to first look at the marketplace. You have to segment the market. You can't sell ice to an Eskimo. That might be good, but so you look at the market to determine how are you going to respond to that market need. How are you going to respond to the intelligence of that market? So, for instance, if you're putting on a particular event, all right, and we're perhaps speaking in the context of the topic as well, the independence of the association, because your associations also put on events as well in order to increase their revenue or create revenue. You look at the market. What does the market demand? It may not be what you wish, but what the market demands. And without compromising principle, you tailor the asset to that market. So, for instance, if you are putting on a stage show, an association, although I discourage that because you don't want to you don't want to go outside your remit too much. How can you marry your asset to the asset in the entertainment industry in a way that will create a viability? In other words, you don't want just simply to put on a show that has a stellar entertainer and it revolves around that entertainer. You might get your gate receipts, hopefully, but then the association doesn't get any value because the asset has not been exposed to a mass audience of 15,000, 20,000. So you will see sometimes sport personalities transition into entertainment. And there are certain managers who are encouraging sport personalities now to consider seriously, while they are alive in sport, an entertainment career. So you have the asset. How do you? Some sport personalities MC shows. And that is how the association gets value for it and a profile from it. Some sport personalities entertain as well. Get value from it. The association gets value. There is also a methodology of, for instance, music is very viral. And particularly when it is it's orchestrated well. There are those who, for instance, go into the studio. Okay? We mustn't divorce sport from entertainment. Sport is entertainment. We see it in NFL, we see it in NBA. And therefore, without getting the athlete too distracted in terms of the performance, you're talking about the longevity, life after track and field. And remember, the monetization of the asset is not necessarily just simply confined to when you are performing. You have to be very structured so that the monetization of the asset takes place after the shelf life of sport.
Now, as you're saying, speaking Chris, I'm seeing in my mind the potential for conflict.
Yes.
Because the athlete wants to maximize their earnings.
Yes.
They want to build their brand. The sporting association wants to do the same. They may feel constrained by a contract. How do we walk between the raindrops so that both will have their satisfaction? Because ultimately, that's what's going to ensure the sustainability.
Excellent, Robert. As an attorney at law, my contract is not simply a definition of rights. It's a relationship. So when the other party reads the contract, they must realize that you are also making a very worthwhile investment and you respect the investment. So when the athlete reads the contract, the athlete must come away with a certain impression that this is for me and this is in my interest, and it is just not simply one-sided. It's a relationship rather than a definition of rights. Once you get over that hurdle, and of course the relationship, the presumption is that the relationship outside of that rubric is positive, then you look in terms of how you can now exercise that right of the athlete without there being a conflict. Clearly, let us get down to the nuts and bolts. You can't give an athlete a contract that is going to say that you're going to earn 80% and he 20% or she 20%. It's just not done. And normally it is the reverse, because the athlete is an asset, the earning asset, and you have to respect that. You also have to give the athlete a comfort that in the event things do not work out and the contract becomes at risk, that he can exit or she can exit that contract from the association without any scars to his or her career. Because we always think of the beginning as well as the end. So there has to be a sense of comfort in the terms of the contract itself. After that is a question of minimizing conflicts, the relationship building. And the relationship, I think, would be far more positive if the athlete realizes that you're going beyond the simple black and white of the contract. You're talking about image building. You're talking about just social graces, social capital now. You're talking, perhaps in some instances, education. You're talking in terms of, I've always said to my clients, if something inexplicable happens to me and I cannot come to a board meeting with certain financiers, and you are there, you should be able, after some years or even some months, to sensibly negotiate the fundamentals of the contract. And that cuts down on suspicion and conflict. I have no difficulty in advising clients that athletes should be there at the negotiating table. They should understand that this is their life, there's this livelihood. They should understand what informs. That breaks down a lot of suspicion, a lot of conflict, and of course it makes the relationship far more easy, Robert.
Now let us drill down a bit and look at the current situation. We're here at the Gold Coast.
Yes.
We are here for the Commonwealth Games. We've seen amazing preparation between the state, between the various organizations. No doubt persons would be back home looking on the games for its entertainment value. But in the context of monetizing our sports and so forth, what are some of the things that you've gleaned here? What are some of the things that you've learned from these games and other games that would be of particular benefit to associations that are watching right now?
Well, hardly in terms of, if you're talking about a major event, Robert, there's hardly a role for the association in terms of broadcast rights. Right? So we have to understand that when it comes to international events, there is a limited opportunity for associations in and of themselves to monetize unless it is, of course, the athlete, which is the asset. What I will say to associations is that coming to international games, and you always have a legal regulatory framework. Certain sponsors can't expose their product and services. because, of course, they are major sponsors of the game and so on. So there are, in fact, limitations where that is concerned. What I will say to you is that in your contractual relationship with your athlete and other third parties, you try as best, and we're talking about, of course, the monetization of the asset in the context of the association's revenue base and earning independence. Do it pre-games, because there is almost an inflexible position during the games. So pre and post. You look at how best that you can earn in the pre and post era. And people tend to think that it is only during the games that you get a lot of capital from the athletes. No. I am willing to proffer that it is before the games that you should be very attentive in terms of how you can derive maximum or optimum benefit from the athlete and after the games. Because in the games, when you just think about it, when you win a gold medal, unless you are, for instance, a superstar like a Usain Bolt, where the whole stadium is singing happy birthday to him, really the hype is after. Because Usain has taught us so many things, but he has also set the bar very high, so that many athletes are going to have a difficulty in becoming the brand. And as Chris had indicated in his presentation yesterday, you can't replicate his brand. You have to culturize and develop your own brand. But unfortunately, such a lovable personality has set the bar high. So pre and post. And there are things that you can do in pre in order to realize the asset as well as to monetize the asset. And there is, of course, a post era after the games that you can do and realize. What are some of the things that you can do?
I'm intrigued by the pre and the post, because yes, the broadcast rights for the whole of Australia are almost
absolutely.
For this. But when we look at things such as a training camp,
yes,
and because you have certain personalities that shine way above others, it really draws. Let me tell you some of the things that you have seen done in the pre to create that anticipation and of course draw attention to sponsors.
It's how you structure the camp, because you have camps and you have camps. All right, so it is how you structure your camps, and here again, you bring the business approach to your camps. We don't want to get lost too much in business, admittedly so, because ultimately it's a performance, but it is the business approach that informs sometimes the performance. How you organize that camp to optimize the training value for the athlete. And at the same time, how do you surgically promote that athlete without distracting the athlete before the international games, because that is important. Okay? So it is how you organize your camp. So you have the facilities there. Science and technology comes into play and ensure that there are appropriate facilities from which the athlete can benefit. But you also have to, and it comes back, everything, Robert, is interwoven. If the athlete understands under the contract that it is he first, she first, and you second, then it's easy for you to say to him or her in the pre-camp, carve out 10 minutes for me, because we're going to go and meet with a sponsor, or the sponsor wishes you to do X, Y, and Z. Because the athlete would understand that that is also critical to the realization of his potential or her potential, as well as his well-being. So we organize a camp to take care of the physical needs of the athlete in order to optimize performance. But you also have to look down the road in terms of how best in that 2 or 3 week period you can maximize the marketing of the talent in a way that there's an ROI for the financer.
Excellent. I want to spend a little of our remaining time talking about attracting international sponsors. For the superstars that you say in Bolts of this world, it is quite easy. But in Jamaica, we have seen some amazing work being done by the Surfing Association.
Yes.
Where they have found their international sponsors. We have found that the rugby have reached out and they've got their international sponsors. What is the 1, 2, 3 key success factors that needs to be had in place to be going out to getting international sponsors for your association?
Brand Jamaica is strong. we are out of the blocks more than other countries. And it is how you, and I use the word advisedly, exploit that brand. So brand Jamaica is strong. So for instance, bobsled, surfing, rugby, those sports that you naturally would not think Jamaica would be well represented in. But because of the brand, you are going to turn your attention to the sport. So surfing, rugby, bobsled, ice hockey. As you know, we have an ice hockey team, and we're working on that team for representation on the international stage.
I tried to find a training facility the other day in Jamaica, but I wasn't successful.
You didn't go down to the ice factory. You should have gone down there, man. But that's another thing, facility, which is part and parcel of the monetization of the asset and the independence of the association. But certainly the asset has to be positioned. And what I would say is that certainly in those sports, as we mentioned there, brand Jamaica. But brand Jamaica gives you a push start. It may arguably not sustain you, and therefore you have to develop, as the bobsled team has done, a culture, a wisdom in terms of how you interface with the international market that will allow you that longevity. So our rugby team has done very well. For 7, the Commonwealth game. How do you go beyond that? Because in any relationship, there's a risk of the attraction waning. So you constantly have to ensure every day that you're doing the right things in order to sustain that attraction. So you go rugby 7, so on like that. It may be you remake yourself. I heard an expression where Bob said was concerned, hot on the ice. Those things may be small, but when you add them up, you're recreating yourself for the international market.
So what I'm hearing from you is managing that personal and association brand
yes.
very well. But I'm also hearing your networking skill, because I know yourself, our first VP and our Secretary General are just amazing in terms of building and networking and creating relationships across.
You're too generous, Robert. You're much too generous.
So those definitely do work. The thought in my mind, however, is that in reaching these international sponsors, how, perhaps I should say it this way, is it far-fetched to imagine a sporting association having a business plan?
Not far-fetched at all. As a matter of fact, it's an imperative. Each association must have a business and strategic plan. That is your map. That is to a certain extent, your DNA. And therefore, you have to ensure that you not only have milestones along the way, but you have a sense of your destiny and your sense of your destination. So, strategic and business plan is not only an imperative for an association, but certainly it is a commercial imperative as well. Because when you go for funding, when you go to interface with your financiers, any financier is going to want to see that sort of business plan, short of asking for your audited financials, because they don't want to be pumping money into a hole. So you have to have a strategic and business plan, which not only indicates quite clearly your vision and your mission, but which also indicates the value that the sponsor is going to have. And this is how we have to be very careful how we create our strategic and business plan. Sometimes we're too insular. Sometimes we're too academic. Premise, counter premise. We have to look in terms of the needs of the association, and by extension the needs of the prospective sponsor and financier, and craft it. Yes, it may sound expedient, but this business, craft it in a way that when you present it for funding, when you present it for partnership agreement with the financier will say, oh, excellent, this is what we have been looking for, value for money, and not simply ferreting a check into your hands.
So from what you said a while ago, I want to put a spotlight on what
yes.
you just said, whereby it's as if you're going to a bank And one of the things that a bank looks for is a management team. Over the years, I've been associated with other sports.
Yes.
And your management team is typically composed of those on your board. It's typically composed of those oldsters who have been in it for long enough. But many of us, we don't take the search for the talent that we require at the strategic level seriously enough to put on our board. What are your comments around that?
Well, I've always said,
approach?
I've always said, Robert, I mean, I don't have much hair on my head, but if one day I wake up and it's all gone, I'm out of an association, it means that it's time to move on. So there has to be succession. But coming back, yes, a financier wants to know your operational governance, and I use that word very carefully. Operational governance, your CEO, your marketing manager, and so on. But sometimes they want to also know who really is setting the policy within which those governors, operational governors, will operate. Yes, they don't want 15 or 20 members coming to pay a courtesy call on them. But they will do their due intelligence, okay, on the board. But the operational governors is who they want really to see, because that is the relationship that they are going to have. And certainly that relationship has to be structured, it has to be well thought of. So when you go to a meeting, you have to have a script. You have to have a script. You have to know exactly what are your objectives. And even before you have to find out what the client wishes, so that you will understand the ethos of the client and be able to hit the mark immediately when you go in. Fluff is expensive. Very expensive.
Sporting association is running a business also.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I want to segue a bit to an area that I'm sure in many countries are having a significant challenge, because not having the Usain Bolt of a Paralympic association, how do these associations survive? Because it may be harder to find that poster child to promote. What would be that running order for a Paralympic association to be able to create this independence of which we favor?
Your fan base is important. And when I say fan base, I don't necessarily mean 50,000, 60,000, 5 million people. Because you can have a fan base of 10,000 that is very influential for the market. The fans, you have to pay. Clearly, if we are going to be putting on a swimming meet or a squash tournament, and you have 2 persons in the audience, and then you have your prospective financier, he's going to be disappointed. What he wants to know is that when he comes to that competition, that all of the fans know the sport. All of the fans will be supporting the sport and not just bag on occupants. Right? He wants to see that the sport is going to be sustained beyond that particular competition. And therefore, you have to look fan base, and at the same time, the small association or those associations that don't have the poster boy or poster girl have to look in terms of the sport itself. You have to excite. So, there are sports that, of course, naturally will excite more than others. Right? We see, for instance, cricket. People are saying, oh my God, test matches. Oh. Apart from the financial implications, they say, no. Because we are living in an era, Robert, and we are affected, should I say, by an instant culture and approach, excitement. No. I mean, the days are gone when perhaps a whole pavilion will come for 5 days with their lunch kit and the newspaper reading while the match is not in play. Furthermore, we are demarcated by, of course, broadcast rights as well. So we have to look, the small association has to look in terms of how can you excite that sponsor. So squash may have to marry sport with entertainment. Badminton may have to marry sport with entertainment. Surfing will have to marry sport with entertainment by having rockers on the beach. Okay? So, creative ways, there's no hard and fast rule. And I think would be guilty if I say that I have the answer. You have to look at particular circumstances and then create what you think is a best model that would be a win-win situation.
I think you said something very, very powerful. When we look at surfing, for example, they have their surfing competitions. It's a big party afterwards.
Yes.
Or they have invited rowers. So on one side of the harbor, they're surfing, and on the calmer side, they're rowing races. So doing activities like that to bring people together.
Absolutely.
And I think the genesis of social media is also, it creates a challenge as well as an opportunity.
Yes.
Because less people are going to go in the stands, but more people may be watching it from their computers.
The average high school boy and girl who does not have a history in sport or who may not care for sport, when they go, social media and otherwise, they have to have an entertainment value. They're not going to watch a tournament online when they are bankrupt when it comes to sport. But if you throw in an entertainment before and after or during, it may gain interest for them. But the marriage of sports, and we have done that in Jamaica, as you know. During football, we have rugby. So sometimes you have to take advantage of mass sports. Cycling during a track meet, cycling during a football, wrestling. Right? Sometimes you have to take advantage of the larger sports.
So Chris, my penultimate question then is that you have done something revolutionary in an Olympic association by assigning groupings of sports to directors. So there's someone for water sports, there's someone for court sports, for combat sports, and so forth. How can these associations take the lead in helping to create these marriages among sports and creating these mega events that will draw patrons?
I had mentioned earlier on, Robert, the silo experience. Gone are those days. And you know we have encouraged it in our deliberations with our associations, that there has to be greater synthesis and marriages across borders. So we're talking about, first of all, the administrators, managers, governors have to understand that yes, we may have a sense of independence, but to a great extent we're interdependent. So once we get over that cultural hurdle, and I understand that I have to eat bread with you and share bread with you, okay, then it is easy for you now to build the relationships and say, all right, okay, guys, badminton, you're going to come to squash, you're going to come to surfing, you're going to so and so. I think that the way how the international economic order is and the economies in various countries are going to be forced to do that. You look at, for instance, the Olympic Games. So many sports are coming on now, on board. Do we have the revenue base to support that mission of all of those sports to the extent that we can develop them properly? We have to create the revenue. We have to marry our efforts. We have to share ideas. And we have tried that, and we are doing that at our in our association. It has paid dividends, and I'm encouraging associations to talk across the fences to see what partnerships that you can develop in a mutual beneficial context.
Chris, it has been an education speaking with you today. Do you have any final word for our audience, both in the studio here and who are listening from the Jamaica Olympic Association website?
Sport is a business. Sport is legal. Sport is economic. Sport is marketing. But more importantly, sport is human relationships. And if you get that right, then the business model, the economic model, the marketing model will naturally fall in place, and you will have a measure of success.
Chris, it has been an exceptional morning speaking with you. There are quite a few things that I got. First, looking at the asset, we have to develop the asset in its totality, the asset being our athletes. We have to look at how we maximize the opportunities from our events. We're looking at our broadcast rights. We're looking at really also building those networks internally between our and among our organizations and internationally. And again, we have to operate like a business. We need to have our business plan. We need to have competent and capable people on our boards driving the association from a very strategic angle. Yes, it has been an absolute pleasure. And our audience, I look forward to you joining us tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, where we'll be having more in this wonderful series. Chris,
Thanks so much, Robert. My pleasure.
All right, thank you, everyone.